How disruptive are the Trump tariffs for international trade? What does that mean for your company and for your supply chains? Those are questions that we want to ask here. For we invited two experts from the IMW network, one from the US and one from Europe, from the Netherlands, I think, but he's also active in Switzerland, Diederik Ising, and he is here to just tell us a bit about his background first.
Yeah, sure, Rob. So good afternoon. So my name is Diederik Ising. I'm managing partner of Canvas, which is an advisory firm in Switzerland. And recently, obviously, we had, let's say, a request from clients to basically help with the question, how do we mitigate some of the increased tariff structures internationally?
And our second IMW supply chain expert is Andy Lukoff, and he's calling in from the US. Andy, thanks for joining us. Where exactly in the US are you located right now?
Yeah, good afternoon, Rob, and thanks for having me. I'm in State College, Pennsylvania, right in the geographical center of Pennsylvania, northeastern United States.
Andy, please also tell us a bit about your professional background, please.
I've got over 35 years of industrial experience, automotive, aviation, chemical, consulting, and I've spent the past 4 years teaching supply chain management. And the interesting thing I've seen over my career is it used to be Lean, Six Sigma, just in time, offshore, outsource, low-cost countries, and especially since COVID, it's been onshore, nearshore, reshore, friendshore. And now with the tariffs, it's just become that much more important that you know your entire supply chain. So from a supply chain management perspective, we were unrecognizable before COVID. And now it's a beautiful life.
Yes, global supply chain management is more relevant than ever. Diederik, let's start with your perspective, the European perspective, on a general note first. What happens to international trade when new tariffs are suddenly being introduced?
I think once tariffs start being activated, you get into a position where there are also local suppliers who become more the obvious alternative. So it can mean that a tariff is being used to distort the market access to clients, and basically opens up, let's say, a direct competition from local or regional competitors.
Well, yes, that is one of the reasons why the Trump administration introduced these tariffs in the first place, right? To bring back industries on American soil. Andy, how has trade changed from the American business perspective?
Right. So I'm thinking about even from the American consumer perspective. I'm talking to many students these days who don't even realize that the tariffs are paid by the importer of record, passed along to the U.S. consumer, which then pays the U.S. government the money. So it is the consumer that has to pay this additional cost, not the overseas shipper. The overseas shipper is going to suffer for sure because the U.S. consumer is not going to be as willing to pay as much because of the tariff being added on. So I do see a significant risk on a global basis just due to tariffs. And that's why you have to be aware of your total cost of ownership, total acquisition costs, all of the time.
Back to the European position, Diederik, what can European-based global multinational corporate organizations do right now to gain a better understanding of where they stand?
I think you first need to kind of understand in what, are you in a business to consumer model or a business to business model? If you're in a business to business model, you obviously start reaching out to your US clients and you start understanding how big they think the effect will be of your product being exported to the US. So if you're a Swiss machine equipment builder, you might have, let's say, a single-digit number of customers in the US whom can be easily contacted and basically asked to kind of understand, okay, what will be the impact of my machine becoming 30, 40, or even more percent expensive, right? So is there going to be a negative effect on the order book, on the existing order book? Will it affect the future order book? And I think in that dialogue, companies will quickly find out if, let's say, B2B customers for high CapEx items will basically cancel it. right? And there, the question for let's say the local supplier of let's say the Swiss producer will be, okay, what am I willing to do, right? So in the short term, they might be willing to basically divert some of the production to other markets, right? Where they know there is also an open order book, so they can save their margins. They might also be open to basically share some sort of profitability loss, let's say, by themselves and with a customer. So a shared pain, especially when certain, let's say, high complex items are needed further on in a US supply chain, right? So in that sense, it's a component which is needed for a follow-up process, right? For instance, building a factory or a manufacturing plant. So I would summarize it for B2B as a mitigation by reaching out, doing a assessment on understanding how it affects, let's say, the existing and the future order book, and trying to find, let's say, tactical options to look at how the profit can be protected.
And Andy, how aware are the US buyers of these changes and their implications, and how fast is this change taking place?
As mergers and acquisitions go on, companies usually keep the same supply base. They reward the buyers for buying more volume from the same suppliers. They get the economies of scale, lower piece price, and nobody sees the bigger picture. Nobody's keeping tabs on the total cost of ownership. And I've seen many cases where a domestic plant has to pay a lot more because the parent company overseas is keeping the local sources. And I've seen that for decades now.
Diederik, what would you consider to be a good starting point in thinking about future adaptations in global supply chains from the European perspective again? Let's start first with the B2C market.
For B2C, let's say Swiss companies with, I would say, fast-moving consumer goods product portfolios and brands, let's say the impact is high. It will be, let's say, an on-cost for the end consumer in the US for their products, and they need to kind of decide, let's say, are there localized options to manufacture, and therefore reducing the impact on tariffs. If that is not possible, then they either need to kind of make a trade-off and say, okay, if this will be something which will remain the same for the next couple of years, right? So how detrimental will the tariffs be for the profitability of their products? And are there any other international markets which could kind of offset some of the loss they might have due to the higher cost of doing business in the US itself, yeah?
Andy, let's try and put this in a historical context for a minute, okay? Have there been earlier instances in the history of global trade where international trade cost structures have been disrupted severely in a short time, and can we learn from those instances?
Think about currency exchange rate or the cost of fuel or other things that have been extremely volatile over the decades. Tariffs are one that just came to mind since the inauguration in January, and that's really highlighted. But remember the global oil crisis in the 1970s. Remember other factors that caused the dollar to change drastically in the 80s and 90s. They drastically changed the cost of supply chain management, and unless you're on top of it at all times, you will lose control.
Diederik, your take on this?
I think what we're now seeing, I mean, tariffs is, I would say, a aspect which basically requires us to act, right? And I think if we talk about supply chain resilience, then what companies need to do is they need to redesign their supply chains for optionality. Optionality is something which some of the larger corporates have already done. Not because of tariffs, but because they have critical supply chains where, for instance, they can't rely on one raw material provider. They need to have, let's say, 2 or 3 in the case that, let's say, the preferential raw material supplier, let's say, would not be able to deliver the goods, right? And would basically impose a risk on their supply chain. So optionality is critical, and that's what I would advise, let's say, every client to think about. What are my options to basically look at the way how I can encourage flexible manufacturing. What are the options to look at different origin diversification? Are there multiple routes in which I can bring my product to the market, to my end consumer? And I think this optionality, which is now triggered by tariffs, if that becomes ingrained in the way how you manage and design your supply chain, these trade disruptions will become a strategic variable, right? And much more than a one-time shock. Yeah? So it will be much more kind of helping you in understanding how you could, let's say, design your route to market, your go-to-market strategy.
Andy, how would you say have US-based companies, buyers on the global market, traditionally approached global supply chain aspects, and how is that changing now and affecting decision-making?
I think based on the fact that decades ago, companies were focused on three things, as I like to say: profit, profit, and profit. And you can get that by acquiring the lowest piece price. And if you can get the lowest piece price decades ago, that more than paid for any extra transportation or time or anything like that. But over time, the factors change. And, excuse me, when the factors change, if you don't keep on top and analyze your data, a bad decision made yesterday, a good decision made yesterday, could be a bad decision made today.
Diederik, again, your take on this as well. What would you advise your clients in Switzerland to do right now on a practical level?
Yeah. Now, I think what's important is that you kind of understand, okay, are we looking for a very short-term resolution to kind of mitigate, let's say, the effects of the tariffs in the US, right, for Swiss companies? Or are we looking for a more tactical, strategic solution, anticipating that this might take much longer than only the Trump presidency, right? So if you believe in the thesis that we are now starting to live in a multipolar world with multiple economic blocks, which will be protecting their own interest and their consumer markets, then in that case, you might want to reevaluate your I would say last decade globalization narrative, where you basically were anticipating that there would be a borderless world without any tariffs, and there would always be an opportunity for larger companies to centralize and find the most capex efficient, let's say, supply chain network to operate their business.
Back to the US buyer's perspective, Andy, what would you advise your US clients that buy stuff on the global market to do right now in order to mitigate these rising import costs, these global supply chain costs, and maybe also protect their market position in the consumer market?
So for me, Rob, it's the basic principle of knowing your entire supply chain. Not only your suppliers, but your suppliers' suppliers. Not only your customers, but your customers' customers. Understand that if you're buying from a company across the country, make sure you understand if they're buying from somewhere across the pond. If you don't understand your entire supply chain, you have that additional risk that you might not be aware of. I think, to your point, that's where a lot of smaller companies just aren't aware. I like to say, if you see something, say something. If something doesn't look right or feel right, it's probably not right. Question. Ask the question, why are we doing this? Does it make sense?
So map out your own supply chains first.
Map out your own supply chain. Make sure you understand plan A is getting it from your supplier, which is located here. But then for sure, you need to have a plan B and a plan C, because something always happens in supply chain management. Something unexpected usually happens. The tariffs, I think, could have been expected to some degree. I think they were. But nobody expected to this magnitude, this quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just worse, quicker, the threat is always there. And it could be something else. It could be some geopolitical issue. There could be many other things. If you know your supply chain, it's where you'll be able to react the best. Make a decision, make it quickly, and look back and make sure you made the right decision based on facts, data, and statistics.
So, Diederik, when your Swiss corporate clients ask you to offer some consultation regarding how to protect their future supply chains and how to make them resilient, basically, for future developments, what do you say to them?
My view, what I would advise clients is that we might want to look around the corner into a different reality, which is a new phase of, I would say, unglobalization, where we also need to anticipate that if we want to be present in key markets like the US with 340 million inhabitants and let's say the largest consumer market in the world, we might want to revisit what our, let's say, stance is with regards to where we manufacture and also where we build capabilities. So getting back to your question, Rob, so on what would I advise clients? I mean, big corporate clients already have, let's say, a international footprint of, let's say, operations and manufacturing. So in the case that they're now heavily penalized by the fact that these tariffs are really eating into their profitability. Let's say the analysis to mitigate on the short term can be very practical.
Oh, we like practical, but what are you referring to? Can you share an example?
So you can look at the HS code optimization in terms of, okay, so are there kind of shortcuts to not being affected by the tariffs? Are there ways on how we look at the engineering of the product and we basically send products in components, we put them together in a different location in the US, right? So, I mean, these are all very short-term tactics. Getting back to the strategic picture, these large companies have the option to basically see the future in the US for the next decades in terms of their profitability and their growth. If they see that from their perspective, there's a good case to look at reestablishing some sort of, let's say, partnership with U.S. companies or a case to build capabilities themselves.
Andy, you stated before that U.S. buyers on the global market traditionally and primarily and maybe solely focused on profit, price, profit. And what now? I sense that you see a shift there, maybe towards people, planet, profit, in that order?
Yeah, so good question, Rob. And for me, it's the change in the metrics that have really driven the answers to your question. First of all, companies used to be focused just on return on investment, profit. But over the years, sustainability has come into the loop. The triple bottom line, people, profit, and planet. Profit's still in there, but it's become less important compared to those others. Sustainability has become highly visible. In the US, it's mandated that all publicly traded companies report their Tier 3 emissions, their CO2 emissions for all product brought into their company as part of their annual report. I think things like that are going to increase in visibility and contain as much, if not more value than just the return on investment.
I want to come back to this topic of global supply chain resilience and building in options for yourself from the European perspective now. So, Diederik, how can Swiss companies, for example, mitigate these insecurities surrounding the introduction of new tariffs? That is also very much related to political developments in the US right now, right?
I think for large, let's say, Swiss clients, let's say the main question would be do you see this as a short-term glitch where we basically have, let's say, the Trump era and tariff disruptions, and after this presidential period, things will kind of get back to the way as we have known it the last decade or decades. and therefore you're going more into a kind of a damage control modus. In that case, if clients are kind of following that thesis, then the options are more, okay, what can you do operationally, tactically to minimize the effects of the tariffs? And they can either be, let's say, moving product away from the US market into other markets. So let's say your capacity management and how you deploy your capacity in global markets. It could be that you look at, I would say, some tariff engineering and some customs engineering. You look at localized partnerships or any other options to see how you could still enter the US market, but under different tariff conditions or maybe no tariffs at all. If you believe in the other thesis, which is basically that we are, let's say, moving into a different era where we are in a world with more polarized, let's say, economic interests, meaning we have different trading blocks, and in that sense, we kind of need to live with that reality. The current tariff, let's say, structure provides, let's say, a good opportunity to reassess your opportunities in the US market. Meaning, what companies have already done for quite a long time is to effectively negotiate the conditions in which they invest in foreign markets. So once we had, let's say, the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a lot of economic activity in Eastern Europe where there were specialized economic zones made available where Western companies could invest into factories. The same is now the opportunity, I would say, in the US. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's not a threat, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to say the US market is a huge consumer market for decades to come and is an opportunity for you to grow as a company. And in that sense, you can also take the, let's say, the attack forward or the approach forward. And use this as a way to kind of assess your possibilities for establishing local manufacturing capacity in the US under preferential conditions.
Andy, you heard Diederik say what he would advise his clients in Switzerland. What would you advise your clients in the US to do first when it comes to these changes?
Number one, you have to have a strategy. And your resilience, your metrics, your KPIs all have to align with that strategy. If you want to be the low-cost provider and you're selling something and country suddenly implements a lot of tariffs, that takes your one objective away and you can't do it anymore. You have to decide what your market is going to be.
Well, one of the challenges with these types of interviews is that we are discussing a very big topic and we are discussing it in broad strokes while we also want to be specific. Now, I assume that there are major differences between different types of industries when it comes to how to implement these changes. What can you say about that? First, Diederik.
For global supply chains, there will not be a one-size-fits-all anymore. We will need to look at optionality where we need to basically understand where our consumers are and where are, let's say, input suppliers, and how do we want to operate that market in the future, under which terms, and how can we further? What's the growth model, right? As well. So,
Andy, do you agree?
I do. I think when you talk things like farming and commodities and things like that, I think trade is going to change a little bit more drastically because of the slim margins. Where there is a higher margin, there is a little bit of room, but the expectation that we're hearing about is that the company should absorb that additional cost from their margin. And I think a lot of companies are saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to find another way.
So what can your clients then expect once they have the options, once you present them with options? How can they then implement this kind of global supply chain management 2.0?
The optionality also means that you can kind of take a game theoretic approach towards competitiveness. So if you're part of, let's say, an automotive industry in Europe, and you know that your key competitors are taking the do-nothing approach, and you are taking the step forward by investing heavily now in the US, you will have a massive, let's say, market share potential in the next decades to basically reap. So that's also an approach you can take, because it's not only about what can I do as a company in these markets. You're part of a competing industry, and what you do affects, let's say, your competitors and vice versa, right? So I think that's also the element. So more the game theoretic element. So who is investing at this moment in time in the US? Are my competitors investing? Should I be investing? And if I not invest, would I miss the boat once this period would kind of stabilize, right? Would I have, let's say, the same competitive advantage as before?
And then, of course, there is the aspect of urgency, Andy, to use a famous American phrase, I think, from the American business world: time is money. So this does make a difference, right? When you act, if you act, what you act, and when.
Yeah,
does it?
Yeah, it does. And I think the insight is tied to resilience, agility, the ability to adjust, adapt, and adopt, the ability to understand that, hey, you need to make decisions rather quickly based on all the facts and data you have available at that moment. You need to make assumptions, state what those assumptions are, but then make a decision and act. I think that's where there's a reluctance right now. People are afraid to make decisions because things might change. Yeah, things might change, but based on what we know today, the best decision is this, that, or the other thing. And then follow up on your decision as frequently as needed. I truly believe nobody ever makes a bad decision intentionally.
Yeah, and making no decision almost always is a bad decision.
I totally agree.
Well, at the end of this interview, why not turn the tables? Andy, what advice would you share with a European company that wants to stay relevant in the US market right now?
Yeah, so Nils, that's a great question. And as I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking really deeply in a couple of examples, and the answer that comes to my mind is, if you're a non-American company and you want to sell in the US, the best way to do business would be to establish some sort of facility in the US to avoid the tariff.
In conclusion, Diederik, what is your closing statement on this topic?
So summarizing, and I think it's a bit of a military slogan, the best defense is in the end an attack. So don't sit on your laurels. Take the problem at hand and look at defining key scenarios, which will give you this optionality going forward.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for sharing your expertise and making us all aware of the complex aspects of this new landscape, this new global reality of international trade. Thank you very much for this interview.